And we're going to talk about this topic, which I've entitled Udderly Amazing. I think the caption on the left speaks for itself. In fact, after the last lecture, I'm surprised you're still here. What are you guys doing here? Well, I have come under a lot of criticism in the world because of the stand which I take, which I believe is bound or based on very sound science. And it might not be so problematic for people of Western Caucasian stock, particularly Northern European stock. But when it comes to Asian nations, African nations, Hispanic nations, then this is a major problem worldwide. And we have to address the problem as to whether one race group can dictate to the entire world what it should be eating and what it shouldn't be eating for health. So we're going to discuss this question of dairy products and see where we stand in the world today and what the scientific literature in the world is really saying. You know, man is the only creature on the face of the earth that believes that he must get his calcium needs out of the udder of another animal. There is no animal on the planet that does that. No animal. Those that receive milk, like for example cats, in a domestic situation, are actually harmed by the process. And veterinary associations throughout the world are saying, don't give your cats milk. It causes kidney problems in them because of the sulfur-containing amino acids. Now let me just explain something to you. Milk is a wonder food for growing infants. Milk is geared to the needs of whatever particular species we are dealing with. We all know that in the zoo system, you cannot just give the milk from one animal to another animal. They tend to die from what they are getting. The fact that humans are so incredibly resilient is a miracle. But you have to be very careful what type of milk and how you modify milk in order to let one species survive even from the milk of another species. You see, the proteins and the amino acid mix that you get in any particular animal's milk is geared to the needs of that particular animal. So cow's milk, for example, a normal cow, now I'm not talking about a dairy cow, one that walks around wild, will only produce about 3-point-something liters of milk per day. Whereas if you go to the industry, these are selected for milk production, and a reasonable dairy cow will produce 20 liters of milk per day. A good one, a really good one, will produce 40 liters of milk per day. A really supersonic one will produce 80 liters of milk per day. And the world champion produced just over 120 liters of milk per day. That means it has an udder weighing 120 kilograms. That means the udder can tear off by its own weight. So they give it a modified bra to hold it on. Dairy cows, calves, grow at a phenomenal rate. They double their weight in a very short period of time, in about 43 days, which a human does in about 183 days. So there is 300% more of the protein casein in cow's milk than there is in human milk. The ratio casein to lactose, the sugar, is also different from in cow's milk to what it is in human milk. And then the protein casein differs from species to species depending on the amino acid needs of that particular organism. Now, when you are growing in an early stage, you don't have that much bone formation. You first start off with cartilage formation and building connective tissue, and then later on you start developing bones and structures like this, and largely this happens once you get to the weaning stage. So in the early growth spurt, your amino acid needs are totally different to what they are after the spurt growth period, which normally comes and ends with weaning. then you have totally different amino acid requirements. So the amino acids that you are getting from your milk at a later age after weaning is totally different to what you needed as an infant. And that is why animals stop drinking milk at a particular age and they go on to what they normally eat because their needs change. Another problem is the digestion of milk. A cow that has a lot of casein and a lot of proteins called lactoglobulins and proteins like that, which are very, very dense proteins, which are in this milk of this particular animal, needs very special circumstances to unwind that protein so that can even be digested. So a calf produces quantities of what is called renin. And renin changes the protein structure so that it can be digested. We say renin curdles milk. Now, humans, having much lower casein and a different casein to what cows have infinitesimal amounts of renin. Some medical books claim they have no renin, but some claim there's a little bit of renin produced. But the digestion of the milk in a human is aided by bacteria which are produced in the breast nodes of the mother, and these are called Bacillus bifidus, which are drunk together with the milk, and that helps with the digestion of the milk. So if you give milk from one species to another species, you end up with a whole lot of problems. The one is the incorrect environment for the digestion of that protein, plus you have the problem of all the other proteins that are in the milk that are indigestible. Let me put this to you simply. The first milk that an infant drinks or that a calf drinks contains what we call colostrum, which contains the antibodies that are required to help the newly developing individual or infant to cope with disease. Is that correct? Okay. Now, what do those antibodies consist of? Or what type of molecules are they? Well, they are proteins. What would happen if the infant drinking those particular antibodies, which are proteins, were to digest them? What would happen? There would be no immunity. Is that correct? So, some proteins are so structured that they are not readily digested. And the infant has the capacity to translocate those proteins undigested into the bloodstream, and that gives it an immunocapacity. You understand that? In the same way, some of these indigestible proteins can be translocated even at a later age without digestion because they are specifically digestive resistant. Unless you have very specific circumstances, like in the case of renin, to unravel the protein so that you can digest it. So a human that receives cow's casein has major problems with the beta-lactoglobulins and with the casein in terms of digesting it, and a large proportion can be translocated as is into the bloodstream. And we'll be dealing with that in a little while. Is it natural for a cow to produce the quantities of milk that dairy cattle produce today? These animals produce vast quantities of milk, as we have discussed. Instead of the normal 3 and point something liters, enough for a calf and a little bit extra if there should be twins or something, they are producing these huge quantities, and they have to be fed very special diets, and they have to be fed various stimulants and growth promoters and milk stimulants, which, by the way, are very often carcinogenic and end up in the milk and have been proven to be problematic. So let's go through this whole question of dairy products, and let's try and be logical about it. Let's try and think about it, and let's see whether what I'm saying is really true or whether it is not true. How good is your milk? You are buying hundreds of thousands of liters of the stuff every single day of your lives because you are indoctrinated to believe that if you do not drink your milk, your bones are going to fall off. Have you ever seen a horse without bones? Have you ever seen a horse go to a cow and they say, please give me your calcium or my bones are going to fall off? Have you ever seen it? Have you ever seen a wild animal that eats nothing but, by the way, where's the cow get its calcium from? From the grass, normally speaking. These animals get their calcium from what they eat. They never get it out of the udder of another animal. But the human being has been led to believe that he must get it from the udder of another animal, or else he is moronic. You know, I almost say Vicky Verky, vice versa. If you think you need it from another animal, you are moronic. Of all mammals, human milk has the lowest protein content and the lowest ratio of casein to whey. Proceedings of the Society of Experimental Biology and Medicine. I will only quote peer-reviewed scientific journals here so that nobody can say I'm quoting Professor Dr. Lucky Spooky and who's saying these things, okay? This is peer-reviewed journal stuff for the hardened scientist. You see, the human being is a very special creature. He grows slowly and he is disorientated in the beginning. He doesn't get up and run around the minute he is born. And he needs special care and special nurture, and the nerves grow slowly. Now you're giving him dairy products, which is geared for making him grow 3-4 times faster than he should be. And we have these nice, huge, big babies. And if you happen to have one that grows a little bit slow, you say, why are you feeding him? Why is he not growing properly? Meantime, you're actually growing something out of proportion with this rapid growth that we induce in the infant. Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition. We should strive to use food to meet the nutrient needs of older infants, yet avoid toxicity. Cow's milk simply does not meet this standard of quality. That comes from the Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition, 1993. Pediatrics, 1992. Babies who are fed whole cow's milk during the second 6 months of life may experience a 30% increase in intestinal blood loss and a significant loss of iron in their stools. The trauma that the digestion of this high casein content does to these babies is that the acidity rises and they experience in their sensitive little intestines blood loss, so that they actually lose iron. We're told if you don't drink your milk, if you don't give them milk, they won't have enough iron, they won't have enough this problem. They're actually losing it. Postgraduate Medicine, 1994, volume 95. Adults who consume large quantities of milk, who have high lactase activity, suffer repeated small galactose challenges, accumulating of galacticol in the lens and greater likelihood of developing senile cataracts. Let me tell you something else about milk. The sugar in milk is called lactose. Now that's perfect for babies. Wonderful for babies. Lactose consists of glucose and galactose. Remember that the sugar that we normally eat, sucrose, contains glucose and fructose. Remember that? And fruit contains which sugar? Fructose. But milk contains galactose and glucose in the sugar called lactose. Right. Now that's good for babies because they haven't got a well-developed pancreatical system. So when they digest it, they get into their bloodstream galactose, and only half of what they get in is glucose, which they can utilize for their energy needs and all those things. Then they have a liver enzyme, which is called beta-galactosidase, and that converts the galactose to glucose as needed. Does that make sense? Now, as soon as a child is weaned, the capacity to produce beta-galactosidase declines and virtually disappears. The capacity to produce the enzyme lactase, which splits it in the stomach into glucose and galactose, declines and disappears with most races, except some who have had a very long history of exposure to dairy products. And I'm talking about white European stock. Black Africans, Chinese, Indians, Spanish people, Mediterranean people, most of the planet is lactose intolerant. When they are weaned, they don't produce the enzyme lactase anymore, and not even Europeans produce sufficient beta-galactosidase to change the galactose to glucose. So what happens is you might digest the sugar, lactose, because you have lactase, but you end up with too much galactose. And this galactose is then a foreign object in your bloodstream and is associated, because the body then stores it wherever it can, in the lens of the eyes, leads to cataracts, but it is highly correlated with ovarian cancer in women and with infertility in women, as we shall see. Well, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, Washington, D.C. also has some of these quotes. Fat and cholesterol. Dairy products contribute cholesterol and fat to one's diet. Comparing the cardiovascular status of ovo-lacto-vegetarians and vegans has proven that while both are healthier than meat eaters, vegans have better cardiovascular status than vegetarians who consume dairy products. And they quote the Journal of the American Medical Association, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Milk fat has been identified as a cholesterol-elevating fat because it contains cholesterol and is primarily saturated. Even the Journal of Dairy Science has to admit that. Iron deficiency, we've dealt with it. It causes intestinal bleeding, and therefore cow's milk causes problems in the digestive tract. But what you didn't know, that the evidence for diabetes 1 being produced by dairy products is mounting to such an extent that personally I believe it's almost insurmountable evidence. Insulin-dependent diabetes type 1 or childhood onset is linked to dairy products. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I'll show you more quotes of that. Ovarian cancer. A Harvard study found that when dairy product consumption exceeds the enzyme's capacity to break down galactose, remember it switches off after weaning, there is a buildup of galactose in the blood, which may affect women's ovaries. Lancet, 1989. That's the British medical magazine. Then, cow's milk linked to diabetes. New evidence, this is 1999, published in Lancet Medical Journal. New evidence published Friday adds weight to the controversial theory that feeding cow's milk to babies may cause them to develop diabetes in later life, the Lancet Journal said. Nature, 1978, already said drinking cow's milk may weaken the immune function in children and lead to problems with recurring infections. A young age at introduction of dairy products and high milk consumption during childhood may increase the child's risk to developing juvenile diabetes. Diabetologica, 1994, volume 37, page 381 onwards. Why is dairy correlated to diabetes? Let me explain the theory. The protein casein is the one which cannot readily be digested. So when you have cow's casein go into your system, some of that cow casein is translated directly into the bloodstream. And the body recognizes it as an intruder and makes an antibody. Unfortunately, some of the amino acid sequences on casein are very similar to the amino acid sequences on the surface proteins of the beta cells of the pancreas. So now you've made an antibody to casein, and the body also finds that that antibody can latch onto the beta surface cells of the pancreas. And then it kills the beta cells, and then you are a diabetic type 1. Then the argument was, now hang on a second, this cannot be true, because many infants are getting diabetes type 1, particularly in Japan, where they are lactose intolerant and they don't use dairy products. They found that some infants were getting diabetes type 1, although they never ever received cow's milk. And so the cow's milk hypothesis was eradicated on the grounds of that, until they made an interesting discovery. They found by correlation studies that a lot of these infants came from parents that had exposure to Western lifestyles. The mothers had, let's say, lived in the good old US of A at some stage, and the mothers were drinking milk. So they took the mother's milk and analyzed it, and guess what they found? They found bovine casein in the mother's milk. So the mother was drinking it, translocating it into her blood. It was ending up in the mother's milk. The baby was drinking it, and you get it at a particular stage in the genetic development. Whammo, there it is. So the evidence that diabetes 1 is caused by dairy is mounting. Early cow's milk exposure may increase juvenile diabetes risk by 1.5 signs. Diabetes Care, 1994, volume 17. Diabetes does not occur in diabetes-prone rodents reared on a diet free of cow's milk for the first 2 to 3 months of life, indicating that cow's milk protein can trigger the disease. New England Journal of Medicine. Do you need more? Researchers from Rome and London said they studied 47 patients who recently developed insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus and found that 51% had immune cells that grew and replicated when exposed to a protein called beta-casein found in cow's milk. Only 2.7% of healthy people in a control had immune cells that reacted to cow's milk protein. Daniel W. Kramer, Harvard Medical School. 5 years ago, Kramer linked galactose consumption, that's the sugar, with increased risk of ovarian cancer. And American Journal of Epidemiology, they now report a correlation between high rates of milk consumption and waning fertility beginning in women just 20 to 24 years old. Now, I'm quoting the literature here from the scientific journals because in my country they always say, what if I say, what if I say, he's a bit, what, and you see the whole world is a bit, because they're all saying it. The strength of that association and the rate of fertility decline grew with each successive older age group. In Thailand, for instance, which is a lactose-intolerant environment where they don't drink milk, 98% of adults are hypolactasic. So they are 98% lactose intolerant. They don't produce the enzyme lactase anymore. Average fertility in women 35 to 39 is only 26% lower than peak rates at 25 to 29. So the women don't become infertile. By contrast, in Australia and the United Kingdom, where hyperlactasia affects only about 5% of adults, white European stock, they still have the enzyme. Average fertility by 35 to 39 is fully 82% below peak rates. The dairy correlation is phenomenal. Cataracts, we've already dealt with that. Digestive disease and science, galactose seems to be the problem. By the way, galactose, if that is the problem, people always ask me, well, what about yogurt? Surely I can still have yogurt. Well, you see, the bacteria can break down the lactose and they ferment it in the milk, and then they can only utilize the glucose component because they have the enzymes to do that, but because they don't have the beta-galactosidase, they cannot cope with the galactose component. So these yogurts have very high levels of galactose, which are problematic in terms of fertility and ovarian cancer and cataracts and all those types of goodies. So if people ask me, is it good? I'll say, well, it doesn't have the lactose and it doesn't have that problem. It still has the casein and it still has the galactose problem. So by my book, bye. Lactose intolerance, I'll deal with that later. Food allergies, milk is one of the most common food allergens. Toxins, like other products from animal product secretions, contain frequent contaminants from pesticides and drugs. About a third of all milk products is contaminated with antibiotic traces. Now let's have a look at the ethnic group intolerance to just lactose. African blacks are 95 to 100% lactose intolerant. That means that if you give a black African milk to drink, he will get diarrhea. That's what he'll get. He'll get diarrhea, bottom line. You give a little black African child that has been weaned dairy to drink, milk to drink, he'll get diarrhea. They are dying like fire. What was the number 2 cause of death in Africa? Diarrhea. You know, I go onto national television and I say, you know what? You white people down here, you prescribe that the diet that the black people must eat is milk and more milk. If Africa is starving, what do they send by the plane load from United States, from Europe, from Africa? What do they send by the truckload and train load and plane load and boat load? Powdered milk. And these poor people already undernourished, eat the powdered milk. They are lactose intolerant. They get instant diarrhea. They say this is the white man's poison. They make a paste of it and they paste it on their huts, which is the only thing it's good for. What arrogance to assume that we who are lactose tolerant can prescribe to Africans and Indians and Asians and Native Americans and Mexican Americans and African Americans and Mediterranean people and all of these that they should eat exactly what these people eat down here. And by the way, they just tolerate it because it's lactose that they can tolerate. They can't tolerate the casein. They cannot tolerate the galactose, but because you don't feel it immediately, because you don't run to the toilet with a stomach ache, doesn't mean it's good. Osteoporosis. How important is dietary calcium in preventing osteoporosis? Science started asking that in 1986. Colic. 1 out of every 5 babies suffers from colic. Pediatricians learned long ago that cow's milk was often the reason. We now know that breastfeeding mothers can have colicky babies if the mothers are consuming cow's milk. Pediatrics, 1991. Just quoting the scientific literature, not me speaking. Let the science do the talking. Osteoporosis is caused by a number of things. One of the most important things being too much protein. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Journal of Nutrition, the volume Science. Leukemia. Canadian Journal of Comparative Medicine. Bovine leukemia virus antibodies were present in 59% of newborn calves tested. Now, is that transferable to humans maybe? Human T-cell leukemia virus can be transmitted from humans to animals. Oops. So you can get a virus going across the barrier of the species. Such results suggest that a milk-borne infection being transferred from a mother to her baby is very plausible. Whether it can pass from the cow to a human is being studied. That came from the Japanese Journal of Cancer Research in 1985. But the plot thickens. Iowa, a dairy state, has a higher rate of national average than the national average for human leukemia. American Journal of Epidemiology, they knew that in 1980 already. Pennsylvania veterinarians have been able to grow bovine leukemia virus in human cells in the laboratory, and a 1980 study showed increase in human leukemia in areas where high levels of bovine leukemia occurred. That comes from Science. Let's get a little bit closer to the 90s. Cows infected with BLV, bovine leukemia virus, had significantly greater milk production than their non-bovine leukemia infected herd mates. Now you have a farmer, and the one cow produces a lot, and the other one not so much. Which one does he get rid of? The one that doesn't produce so much. So he's actually selecting in his herd for a higher probability of bovine leukemia virus, which could mean that more BLV-tainted milk is being produced than previously estimated. Proceedings of the National Academy of Science of the USA, 1989. Let's go to mid-90s. These data confirm, this comes from the Veterinary Research, American Journal of Veterinary Research, 1995, volume 56, page 445 onwards. These data confirm the presence of BIV in milk and identify the potential for lactogenic, that's milk transmission, of the virus. So there is a probability, a relatively high probability, that even leukemia, some types of leukemia, are associated with dairy. Multiple sclerosis, Acta Neurologica Scandinavica, the present data indicate that MS patients exhibit an antibody activity against BLV, bovine leukemia virus. Many amorphotropic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease patients reported consuming large quantities of milk, Neurologica. What about other diseases? Many diseases such as tuberculosis, we spoke about it earlier, remember it was the number, how many killer? Number 3, I think it was. Yeah, the first one was respiratory, the second infectious diseases, then came diarrhea, then came TB. Brucellosis. You know, I went to the abattoir with my students. I always do this to them. I take them to the abattoirs and I show them how everything works, and from the farm to the industry. And for at least 1 week after my course, all my students are vegetarian. But I went to the inspectors there, And, they're cutting up the livers and they go, and I said, why are you throwing so many of these out? No, these have got parasites. And I said, no, why have they got so many parasites? It's just, no, things have changed. I don't know. In the past, they never had so many parasites. Maybe 1 in 100. Now, every second, third one we throw away. And then he said to me, and there's another problem. All of us, every single inspector in the entire industry had brucellosis. Wow. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, Q fever, gastroenteritis are transmissible by milk products. Journal of Dairy Science, even they know it. Even they know it. Milk is an excellent vehicle for infection because its fat content protects pathogens from gastric acid, and being fluid, it has a relatively short gastric transit time. Journal of the American Medical Association. Do you need more? Or are you convinced that it's not me just that is beginning to voice the idea that dairy has more to offer than meets the eye? Big stink over smelly cheese. Fear of listeria contamination. 1999, listeria infection in the UK, exponentially rising since 1986. Listeria organisms excreted in cow's milk escaped pasteurization. Oops. Grew well at refrigeration temperature. Double oops. And were ingested by consumers. New England Journal of Medicine. They know that since 1985. These results support the hypothesis that human listeriosis can be a foodborne disease and raise questions about the ability of pasteurization to eradicate a large inoculum of listeria from contaminated raw milk. New England Journal of Medicine, 1985. We actually did some tests in South Africa, taking raw milk, taking pasteurized milk, and taking retail milk. And we find high lacto, very low pathogens. Then we find no lacto, very low pathogens. And then in the retail, high pathogens, no lactose. That's why milk doesn't tend to go sour so easily, but rather goes bad, smells bad. That's from the funny bacteria that are left over. Just to show you that, I do get into the newspapers. Prof's crusade against milk has them frothing. Don't let your kids drink it, says zoologist. And I think my name's over there, Walter Fight, says so-and-so. And, of course, the dairy industry goes ballistic. My name is a swear word. You have some interesting books here in your country. Move Over Milk was quite interesting. This one's interesting. This is about court cases that have been suppressed by the industry. Milk, the deadly poison, milk and all what it contains. And of course, there are a lot of hidden dairy products in whatever we eat. Which brings me to the exciting issue of cheese. Let me let that sink in. Drink it in, folks. Drink it in. Isn't this exciting? How good is cheese? Now, I want you to put on your thinking caps. Let's work through this one logically. Let's just think about it for a while. Let it ferment in your minds. How does one make cheese? You use milk. And then you curdle the milk, right? Okay. And then you get the whey, which has the whey proteins and all those funny guys in them, the beta-lactoglobulins and all the minerals and all that stuff in it. And you take that and you put it one side, and that's called a waste product. So you dry it down and you sell it to the bakery and to the health industry, and you say you've put that in everything. And you will read on your labels, whey protein, whey this, whey that, whey that. Okay. Then you take this curd, and the bacteria do their thing. And eventually they change all the lactose to what? Well, to glucose and galactose. And then just like in the case of the yogurt, they eventually use up all the glucose, and that leaves the galactose, which is not so hot as we saw. Would you agree? But the bacteria have a major problem with digesting the casein. You see, you need renin to digest the casein properly, or you need special types of criteria to digest the casein properly. So they don't do such a good job with the casein because they cannot digest it, By the way, the bacteria have exactly the same enzymes you have. And then you allow this cheese to mature, which means that the bacteria have utilized everything in the cheese that they can utilize and left everything behind which is totally indigestible to the bacteria. Does that make sense? And then it is a mature cheese, which is something you can store probably for about 50 years without it disappearing. It might get a green mold on it. A mold can still work on it from the outside for a while. But generally, you know, if you dry it hard enough, you could build a house with it. Am I correct? Okay. Now you have this product. But if you really analyze it, everything you cannot digest anymore, as one of my colleagues said to me then, do you mean to tell me it is the feces of the bacteria that's left over? And I said, well, more or less, yeah, I guess you could say that. Now, I know I'm terribly mean, but let's think about this further. Now, you don't have those enzymes either that the bacteria didn't have to deal with the rest. So now you take this cheese and you pop it into your stomach. Boom. And there it is. And cheese has this marvelous ability of producing the greatest sense of satiety of all foods. In German, they have a saying, Käse schließt den Magen, which means cheese closes off the stomach, which is exactly what it does. You see, once the cheese is in the stomach and the digestive juices go to work on it, and they go to work on it, and they go to work on it, and they go to work on it, eventually they send through a test sample through the duodenum, and the receptors say, macromolecules, nothing done. That's as Bob talks, right? And then it says, close up. And then it closes it up, and the concrete mixer goes on. That is why the best meal to give your guests is cheese. And the most popular buffet at business luncheons and business dinners is cheese and wine. Why? Because once you've put that indigestible something into the stomach, nobody will complain for the rest of the evening that they're hungry. Have you noticed that? So instead of the food in your stomach being digested in a relatively short time, it stays in there until the sampling procedure through there has taken place so many times that eventually the stomach does empty. Still doesn't mean that you've digested it. It can stay in there sometimes for 10 hours. Your poor stomach doesn't know what to do with it. And that is a fact. It hasn't got the foggiest idea what to do with it. It is my personal conviction that cheese should never enter the human stomach. That's my personal conviction. Now, that's just the logic behind it. That doesn't prove anything yet, right? Let's get to a little bit of science and let's see what dairy products are really all about. So I was very excited when I discovered that dairy products were, for example, very highly correlated with diseases, particularly cancers, and in men, particularly highly correlated with prostate cancer. I'll come to that in a little while. Being one of the most mucogenic foods in the world, the mucoid glands of the body are particularly infected. So dairy products tend to create respiratory problems, are major problems for asthmatics, and any mucoid gland, like the prostate gland, could be highly clogged when you have things like dairy in your diet. So we decided to do a couple of tests. The first, I have this fortunate position that I have all these students at my disposal who have to do exactly what I say. That's so nice. So we decided, let's try an experiment on rodents. And we used rats. And we put them on a diet normal balanced diet, everything that they need, much better than they would get from the pellets you buy in the pet stores for them. And we put one group on a diet which had soya as the main protein source, and the other group casein. Now remember, we are just dealing with the protein now. We're not dealing with the lactose or any of those which can cause diarrhea. Are you with me? Just the isolated protein. And then we looked at what happens in this rat. Firstly, what was interesting, of course, was the urinary pH, which is an indicator of acidosis. And interestingly enough, when they were on soya, and significant differences there, when they were on soya, they had a more alkaline urine, indicating that they were more alkaline in their metabolism than when they were on casein. They were more acid. So casein caused acidosis. We wanted to know, of course, about calcium. So we looked at the total fecal calcium, and lo and behold, when they were fed casein, there was much more calcium in the feces than when they were fed soya. In other words, they weren't absorbing the calcium. Is that correct? Probably because of the acidosis induced by the casein. We looked at urea production, which is an indicator of the rate of turnover of the protein, and we see that when they had casein, they had to reject or metabolize far more of the amino acids and excrete it than when they were on soya. And there's a highly significant difference between the two groups. So casein means more elimination of what you are eating. What about urinary calcium? Oops. When they were on casein, they lost far more calcium than when they were on soya. So casein is calciuretic. It means you lose calcium. So when they tell you drink your milk so that you get your calcium, number one, you don't absorb it. Number two, you excrete it. It's not available to you. No wonder Gambian women who never ever drink milk have perfectly healthy bones even after pregnancy, with a calcium consumption less than a third of what American women eat. And they get it from dairy, and they have all got bone problems after the event. But African women don't. And then remember that this is casein and not milk, so there's not lactose in it. It's just the protein. Just the protein. Everything else was the same. The fiber, everything was the same. Look at the highly significant difference in the wet mass of the feces. So if they were on casein, they produced a very dry pellet. And when they were on soya, they produced a very moist pellet. In other words, going to the toilet, if they were on casein, was that eye-bulging experience I spoke about. Now, you know what's interesting? You know what one of the major problems of white European infants is when they are on cow's milk? Constipation. White Europeans suffer tremendously from constipation. My own kids got cow's milk because I was a moron at that stage. And you know what? My kids had to regularly be taken to hospital to cut the stuff out at the back and pull it out with tongs. So constipated were they. And I wouldn't believe that it could be something like milk. I mean, everybody drank milk. You see? People can change. And black Africans who cannot deal with the lactose, what is their problem if you give them dairy? They have diarrhea. So the whites who have got lactose and who are not lactose intolerant and who have the enzyme lactase don't get diarrhea, but they get constipated, and the other group gets diarrhea. And you can't put the two together because you don't link it to the races. You understand? And this is interesting stuff. I love it because in my country, this is a racial issue. And the racism is now on my side. It's so nice when the scientists oppose me, I say, you're being racist. Whew, dead silence because they're dead scared of that word. It's a very big swear word in my country now. I know I'm being unfair, but I like it. Then the people say, woo, but that was a rat. So we decided, let's try it on a rabbit. Well, let me first show you one thing. when we fed them soya, casein, or milk solids, the orange over here is milk solids, you will see that the group that received casein or that received milk had no problems growing. So you can grow, you can get enough, and because casein is also a metabolism stimulant, remember cows grow very fast, the rabbits actually grew very fast on the milk solids and on the casein. And they grew slower on the soya. By the way, slow development, is that necessarily abnormal? I want to ask you a question. Do you think it is normal that a little 9-year-old girl, a little 8-year-old girl, no, even worse, a little 7-year-old girl should start menstruating? Do you think that's normal? Do you think that God designed it that little 7-year-olds should walk around having the capacity to produce children? But when they are not on animal proteins and when they are not on dairy, they tend to develop much later, sometimes 14, 15, sometimes 16. And you say, oops, there's something desperately wrong with that. No, I think there's something desperately wrong with a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 9-year-old developing early menstruation syndrome. So you grow well on it, but that does not necessarily mean that it's good. Then we looked at urinary calcium loss, soya, casein, milk. Look at that. Boom, lowest, high, high. So whether it was the protein alone or whether it was the milk solid, full dairy, can you see that there was virtually no difference? Question. Low-fat milk, will it help you? Nope. Why not? Because the problem is the casein. You understand it? So low-fat milk does not help the problem at all. It might help with the obesity problem and the amount of fat that you're getting, but it has no effect on anything else. You still have the bad guys. It's no better for you than any of the others. Fecal calcium loss, soya, casein, milk solids was the highest. So milk, casein is higher than soy, but milk solids are the worst. So the fat, even that, inhibits calcium absorption. So you don't get good calcium from milk. Bottom line, whatever they say, it's not true. Maybe milk has a lot of calcium, but it's of no use to you, or of very little use to you. Let me rather put it that way. Urea production, look at that. Hardly any difference between casein and milk solids, but milk solids always seems to be the worst. So let's have a look at just soya versus milk solids. Cholesterol, soya, milk solids. Isn't that a massive difference? Massive difference. These are rabbits fed 18% protein ration from milk solids. That means they get carrots and lettuce leaves and everything else that they also need. That's just their protein need supplied by that. So you can see that you have low cholesterol, high cholesterol. That's just looking at the milk solids. LDL, that's bad cholesterol, much lower in soya, very high in the milk. Then we look at HDL, that's good cholesterol, high in soya, low in milk. Wow. So what does the soya do? It gives you a lower cholesterol, and the ratio HDL to LDL favors good cholesterol, whereas with milk solids, it favors bad cholesterol. So let's look at that ratio, HDL, LDL, which is the best indicator. Soya, excellent. Milk, not so hot. Total cholesterol, you saw soya much lower and milk higher. So, which is better? Well, there's no doubt about it. So let's not look at milk solids. Let's look at casein. Exactly the same story. Cholesterol, soya low, casein high. So what is the problem? Is it the amount of cholesterol in the milk, or is it the type of protein in the milk? That's what we discussed last night. The problem is the type of protein. So, low-fat milk will solve your cholesterol problem, right or wrong? Oh boy, you guys are sharp. It won't help, because the problem doesn't lie with the cholesterol. That's why people are so confused about the cholesterol issue. They eat food sometimes very high in cholesterol, and they don't really develop that major problem. It's the type of protein associated with it which causes the problem. So if you look at the health food industry and the protein supplements that people are getting, do you know what they all contain, or virtually all? Casein. Throw it away. It's meant for cows, not humans. Throw it away. And when you read on the label, dairy substitute, this really gets my goat up. Soya milk, dairy replacement, contains soya protein, whey protein, and casein. I think I could get moths. Why would you like to make a substitute for dairy using dairy? You know, even the industry is moronic. If you're going to make a substitute for dairy, then don't use dairy to make the substitute. And if you're going to make a substitute vegetarian food, don't use whey and don't use casein. Go to your stores, read on your labels and on your meat products, replacement products, what does it say? And you'll find if it says that, don't buy those brands. They'll change that tune after a while. All right, when we looked at casein, HDL, LDL ratio, again, when it was on soya, it favored the HDL relative to the LDL. Casein was bad, soy was good. Right, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes are good sources of boron, which helps stop calcium loss in the body because milk is low in boron and high in phosphorus and protein. It is not a good osteoporosis fighting food. Nutrition Today, 1988, FSAB Journal, 1987, they know it. But the dairy industry in the world is so powerful, you cannot get by them. Greens, such as kale, broccoli, bok choy, are as good as milk in terms of their calcium absorbability. Environmental Nutrition, January 1994, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 1990. Even when eating 1,400 milligrams of calcium, which is way over the recommended daily allowance of calcium daily, one can lose up to 4% of his or her bone mass each year while consuming high-protein diet. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They knew that since 1979. Under controlled conditions, the level of dietary protein has a profound effect on urinary calcium. So the protein is the problem. Traditional African diet, they have very healthy bone structure. They don't have osteoporosis. You will find that they use a lot of legume and they use a lot of maize. That is the staple food of Africa. And now we are telling them, bag that and take cheese and milk. African markets. So we decided, when they said, but that was a rat, and then they said, no, but that was a rabbit. You know how they always say that? Then we decided, okay, we're going to apply to the primate unit. Now, this is one of the most prestigious primate units. And world research is done in this primate unit, and it takes really something to get in there. But we got in there, and the primate is very close to the human in terms of its metabolism. And because, like all creatures that don't use dairy, they are lactose intolerant, they were a perfect model for the African, who would be instigated or converted to a milk program. Would you agree? So they are 95% lactose intolerant. The black African is 95% lactose intolerant. Great model. So we put them on this diet. We put them on a maize legume diet as the basic protein need. Of course, they got their apples and everything else that monkeys get. And the other group got their protein from milk solids. And then we had a look at urine production. And you'll see that if they were on milk solids, they were inclined to urinate more in the first place. And when they were on the maize legume, their stool production, oops, they got diarrhea. You see? High stool production when they were on milk. Just what the Africans would do. You know what the rationale of the opposing scientists was? Oh, but you can't use these experiments because the animals got diarrhea. I said, excuse me, this is exactly what we're trying to prove to you. That's what you're doing to the black Africans. You're giving them diarrhea. Urinary calcium excretion, just look at that. When they were on milk, they lost their calcium through the urine. About 50,000 Americans die each year of problems related to some way to osteoporosis. Osteoporosis International. Dietary protein increases production of acid. I showed you that in the animals. This is now for humans, which can be neutralized by calcium mobilization from the skeleton. American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 1995. We know it, but the industry has such power. It's unbelievable. Let's have a look at this question of milk and infertility. Science News. Women who would like to have a failed to conceive child may want to review how big a role dairy products play in their diet. A new study suggests a team of researchers in the United States and Finland now report that where per capita milk consumption is highest, women tend to experience the sharpest age-related fall-off in fertility. Right. There's the number one point. But we also know that milk affects the prostate gland. So I figured, let's test the milk on the monkeys and see what it does to their fertility, simulating the African black. You know, the African blacks sometimes have a very impoverished diet, but have you noticed how fertile they are? Wow. Whew. No problem. In Europe, 1 in 4 couples have to seek fertility clinics to help them get children. 1 in 4. I mean, really incredibly high. So let's have a look at some of these spermy things. We put these animals, these were the monkeys, on a grain legume diet. Now, the best picture we get when we put them on a sustainable protein diet, just enough for what they needed. Now, in this institute, you're never allowed to feed them anything that they think is bad for them. So everything is in line with their dietary needs. We looked at progressive motility, how quickly the sperm swims. And when they were on a low-protein diet, we saw that the grain legume group had very good motility, right? Progressive motility in the region of 70%, whereas the milk group only had a progressive motility of 30%. That means the sperm was half as fast, you know, it was going when it was on milk. Then we looked at sperm concentration. Wow, look at this. When they were on grain legume, they had an incredible sperm concentration of 320 million sperms per milliliter. When they were on dairy, boom, 100, a third of the concentration. So the sperm were going, and there was only 1/3 of that of the other group. Then we looked at defects in the sperm, mid-piece defects. When they were on dairy, the sperm developed abnormally, statistically different. Milk versus maize legume, the African diet. And most of them seem to have this mid-piece defect, where they have this bump in the mid-piece, or this tail defect. So now the scenario is that if you are on milk, the sperm going, there's only 1/3, and those that are there are going, So what's the solution? If you want to be fertile and you want to be a macho guy, get rid of the garbage. What was also very interesting is the lymphocyte levels. This is a measure of the immunocapacity of these animals. When they were on the maize legume diet, simulating the African traditional diet, they had excellent immune capacity. As soon as we put them on milk, they had a very poor immunocapacity. And the same for HDL, LDL. Remember, we need a good HDL, LDL ratio. The monkeys were very good when they were on the maize legume diet and very poor when they were on the other diet. The proof of the pudding is in the blood vessel in the end. There you have the blood vessel of one that was on the maize legume diet, squeaky clean, all the little side vessels of the aorta, perfect. And look at this one, totally clogged. Even the side vessels were clogged. This was a serious case of arterial disease as a result of dairy products. Remember, the African people are far more prone than the white people of getting cardiovascular disease. Do you remember those statistics? So the monkey is a perfect example to show why, because it has such a high sensitivity, just like the lactose intolerant nations would have. So we did the histology, and you see that the one on maize legumes, squeaky clean. There is the plaque in the other one. And what is more, it was calcified, which means this was a perfect aneurysm case. Pop goes the artery. So no wonder they have these products. All right, we looked at soy milk versus milk solids. That was the diet, just to show you that they got total proteins, about 18% roughly, 17 point something, but they also got carbohydrates and calcium and phosphorus and everything they need. They got apple skins. The ones on grain legume got kidney beans. They had maize meal. Only the ones on milk had the milk powder, but they got everything else that they also needed. And it wasn't just a question of feeding them disproportionate quantities of milk. It was the equivalent of what any Westerner would eat. So milk is implicated in high cholesterol, higher LDL, lower HDL, and total cholesterol concentrations that are totally haywire, as you can see in this particular study where we did a repeat of it just to make sure. And no matter what we got, every time, every parameter we tested favored the maize legume. This is HDL, LDL ratios, highly significantly different. Lymphocyte counts in a repeat experiment, same sort of thing. Unbelievable. By the way, here we tested milk versus soy milk. So we didn't just take soya isolate, we used the actual substitute soy milks that are on the market, and we found exactly the same as for grain legume. Perfect in every single sphere. Lymphocyte counts were better in the traditional than in the other. So what's the best way, if you haven't got drugs, to fight the AIDS virus that causes so much mayhem? Best thing you could do for number one is remove all dairy products from those people's diets. That'll raise their lymphocytes levels, because that's the first thing that goes down when you have AIDS. You know, simple dietary change might help them a lot more than all these drugs that don't seem to do that much anyway. So the reproduction in the vervet monkey, sperm concentration in another experiment that we did, and you can see here the same sort of thing happening in all the parameters tested. So we did it over and over again because we got so much criticism, and every time we got the same results. Oh, but that is a monkey. That's the next argument that you hear. You know, it drives you nuts. No matter what you do in the scientific world, they'll always have an answer. Don't mess with my plate. All right. So we went to the literature and looked at dairy consumption and hip fracture in the human population. And what do we find? South African blacks, boom, down there. And the good old US of A, boom, up there. So high dairy consumption, high osteoporosis. No dairy consumption, virtually no osteoporosis. And by the way, that's just hip fracture, right? Which is an indicator of osteoporosis. So these hip fractures can be from accidents and things, and not necessarily related to osteoporosis. African blacks don't have osteoporosis. So now, would you agree with me that the evidence is overwhelming that dairy is not the way to go to get your calcium needs? Would you agree with me? Would you agree with me that casein is a problem in terms of digestion? And that the only thing that makes it digestible for the whites is that we have lactase. But when we insist that the other nations do it, we are not doing them a service. We are doing them a disservice. And I'll tell you what, with all this information, I'm not going to win this battle. I cannot compete against the white-rimmed little black faces on television's advertising campaigns. I cannot compete. They have cartoons of me swinging on the monkey's tail to ridicule the research that we are doing. The industry is sharp. The industry is very sharp, but they are toxic And one day they're going to pay a price. One day they're going to do it. Calcium consumption. Well, the United States has the highest supplementation of calcium, and it still has the highest hip fractures. You know what? Those proteins are actually destroying the cells in the bone. We did a lot of experiments where we counted the cells in the bones. And when they were on these high protein diets or on the animal protein diets, the cells in the bone actually died. Let me give you an example. I have a bricklayer, and he can lay, let's say, 500 bricks a day. That's his maximum. That's his maximum speed. I have 2 bricklayers up there, and they can do that. How many bricks can I lay a day? 1,000. One of them dies. How many bricks can I lay? 500. And I can throw 1,000 at him. I can still not lay 1,000 bricks. Would you agree? So I can take calcium till it comes out of my ears. If I haven't got the bricklayers in the bone, they will not build it into the bone. Bottom line. So solve the problem at the dietary level, get your cells healthy, and throw at them the number of bricks that they need, and they'll be perfectly happy. You don't need all that heavy supplementation. Dairy product consumption and prostate cancer, there's the correlation for you, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Just look at that. Incredible rise. Just 4 glasses per week, and you have 2.5 times the risk of getting prostate cancer. Asthma, gasping for breath. Dairy products may play a major role in the development of allergies, asthma, sleep difficulties, and migraine headaches. Israel Journal of Medical Science, Pediatrics. That is the problem. My own wife was a major asthma sufferer. Out went the dairy, out went the asthma. If you look at the U.S. drug advertising in terms of dollars, in millions of dollars, you'll see that allergies are the number one drug, anti-allergens are the number one drugs advertised in this country. You have so many allergies because you eat so bad. The man's cancer. Some who have died lost the battle. Ayatollah Khomeini, Telly Savalas, you remember some of these guys. World breast and prostate cancer. Look at that. Switzerland, Norway, Luxembourg, Iceland, Sweden, Uruguay. Those are the countries that have the highest prostate level. Those are the high dairy countries in the world. And last night already we said that African blacks and black people in general have a much higher rate than white people. Why? Because they're much more sensitive to these issues. So what are you going to do with this type of meal in the future? Well, I don't want to be descriptive to you. You know, I don't care what people eat, and I'm not interested to tell people what they must eat. All I am doing is providing information on the basis of which you can make a decision. But I would never suggest that anybody look into somebody else's plate and say, still eating cheese, are you? I had one guy came to me one day. He was one of these perfectionists, preaching that we all must be absolutely perfect. You know, the Lord can't come if he hasn't got absolute perfection everywhere on the planet. And I asked him, do you really believe that absolute perfection is possible? And his answer was, well, look at me, I don't eat cheese anymore. That's the truth. I thought I was going to die. So I would suggest to you that you have another look at dairy products. Don't become overly zealous. Don't become fanatical on the issue. But have a look and see what you can do. And if you see that you can cope, because there are lots and lots of good substitutes, you can make great creams and great nut creams and nut sauces, and dairy sauces can be replaced with soya sauces. You can make great mayonnaises, great Thousand Island dressings by just using soy milk powder. And you've got all these things right here at your disposal. A little bit of lemon juice, a little bit of liquid, and a little bit of something of this and a something of that, and you make great mayonnaises. You can do great things. A little bit of tomato paste and something in there. You've got 1,000 Island dressing. You can have great fun. It's just a question of learning. No gain without the pain. So take a nice relaxing break for about 45 seconds and be back for the final episode. Thank you very much.